Szeretettel
Welcome back. Hope you have enjoyed your lunch and your informal discussions during lunch. The previous presentations, I think, were a good soil for further discussions. The reason why I'm standing by the mic is not that I am the next speaker, but I would like to introduce or to interpret or convey the message of our next speaker, Eva Maria Barki, who is an international lawyer, and she sent her speech in a written form. I would like to read it for you.
So the presentation of Dr. Eva Maria Barki, international lawyer. Dear President, ladies and gentlemen, the whole world is going through a great transformation. So is Europe. If we want to talk about the future of Europe or the future of the European Union, which are two different topics, first of all, we have to review the historic reasons and how we got to the present situations. Europe is in deep crisis. People feel more and more about the bureaucratic changes in Europe and the more and more dictatorial system, the consequence of which is an unforeseen loss of trust. Europe is in front of such a great change as it was 30 years ago when the Western and the Eastern blocs were still facing each other. 30 years ago, to be precise, in March 1988, in my first Hungarian speech at the EuCET Theatre in Budapest, I was encouraging the newly formed Hungarian Democratic Forum that every dictatorial governments are doomed to fail. So Eva Maria Barki said that 2 years before the change of the political regime in Hungary. Because it is the nature of every authoritarian regimes that they are going to fail at the end, and you are going to win because you have right and justice on your side. And it happened eventually. Today in 2021 I say the same thing, because the fundamental rights and freedoms and national sovereignty are basic rights, and the loss of these values or these principles is a threat to us, but this threat is not coming from the East, it's coming from the West this time. We have to suffer on the daily basis the discrimination and the attacks of the Western tyrannies with the support of the liberal media there. So why was it a missed opportunity after the end of the Cold War that we create a true European cooperation when the nations of Europe were not sitting with each other as winners and as losers, but as equal nations? And the answer to this question is because the West didn't want it. I had the personal experience to prove it when I was in different European countries, and also I visited the Congress of the United States in the 1980s. A higher-ranking official actually called me on the phone and warned me that I should not question the Warsaw Pact because that's a reality. And actually the American ambassador, Warren Zimmerman, shared the same opinion, and even representatives of the Hungarian Democratic Forum could not convince him. And including the West, the Western powers, including the German politicians, did not want a united Germany. They did not want the Berlin Wall to fall. The people would only manage to achieve these things in a peaceful revolution. Now, after that, so after the Berlin Wall fell and Germany reunited and Gorbachev declared the fall of the Soviet Union, and then there was the conference organized in November 1990 in Paris, and the Paris Charter for the New Europe was born. Only then, in this format, which was also signed by the European Community, the parties confirmed the equality of the nations, and they took the initiative to ensure the sovereignty and independence of all nations, and they all stated that Europe is at the beginning of a new era. But these good intentions only remained on paper, and they were not realized in practice. The European Community actually later opposed this sovereignty when they turned against the independent initiatives of Slovenia. The same thing happened about Croatia when the Croatian people declared their independence. And so, without the lacking of the Western states, both of these nations had to fight for their freedom in bloody wars. And actually, the Western countries only recognized them as sovereign states a year later. So, why did this happen? It was because of the geopolitical and foreign policy principles of the United States. Well, first of all, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States had the monopoly of power in the world as the only remaining superpower. President Bush in 1991 already proclaimed the New World Order, which is based on the Wolfowitz Doctrine, and it increased the hegemony demands of the United States over Europe as well. The goal up to this day is to surround Russia as the enemy power. The intervention in Europe was based on the heartland theory. This theory was worked out, this doctrine was worked out in 1904. Those who have power over Eastern Europe have the power over the heart country, and those who have the rule over the heart country has the rule over Eurasia, and those who have the power over Eurasia, Europe and Asia have power over the entire world. As George Friedman, who was of Hungarian origin, said in a think tank interview, this is the theory which still prevails in the United States and is still taught at the academies. And in practice, it means that we have to draw a division line between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, because a possible cooperation between Western Europe and Russia, and especially a possible cooperation between Russia and Germany, must be prevented no matter what, because cooperation of Europe and Asia would be against the American interests. And in this light, we have to interpret the policies about Ukraine, but also they apply this policy over Hungary, because Hungary is also a part of this heartland. So the division of Europe is the ultimate goal of the American politics. George Soros said a few years ago in Brussels that Europe is in war with Russia, but the Europeans don't notice it. Soros is right in this regard, because there is a war in Europe, but this war is not only against Russia, it's also against the peoples and nations of Europe. The second American geopolitical principle is globalization as the basis of global rule. It is necessary in order to make sure that there are no strong states, but there are weak states, and there are societies that are mixed up and societies that are turning against each other. And in the chaos thus created, the people can be easily ruled. The same thing happened in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in Syria, and in Africa too. And this is happening in Europe. The tool to achieve this goal in Europe is migration. And thus the circle is complete, because the migrants came from those areas that were already destabilized by the United States, because the United States triggered the wars and the other conflicts. But the migrants are not led to Europe by Americans. The migrants are led here by human traffickers. And it was described in two books of Thomas P. Barnett that you can read about this. So Thomas Bennett writes that the basic condition of globalization is a strong, continuous migration flow that destroys nations and societies. A new mixed people must be created, which is not homogeneous, not united. It is divided based upon national and religious and cultural values. The general IQ should be around 90. It's not enough to think critically, but it's enough to work. Now in Europe we need at least 1.5 million immigrants per year. Barnett also describes that nobody should resist this plan. If anybody resists, they must disappear very quickly. If somebody endangers globalization, Barnett says, I say kill them. Europe does not represent its independent politics, but it's a very strongly affected, impacted by the United States and the NGOs led by the United States. The EU is actually the entry hall of the United States. And not only the European Union, but Germany, as the strongest member state of the European Union, does that. Germany has not been a sovereign country since the Second World War. It cannot represent any independent politics. The enemy clause is still valid at the United Nations against Germany. Let's not forget that the American troops have still bases in Germany. So de facto, Germany is still controlled by the Americans. The third tool that is used in this war is ultraliberalism, which undermines the traditional European culture. The goal of this neoliberalism is the same as the goal of communism, but they use different weapons. They use discrimination, economic sanctions, blackmail with the help of media. There's only one difference. Communism did not want to annihilate families because Stalin realized in 1936 that that would seriously endanger the state foundations, and despite the Marxist doctrines, Stalin got rid of anti-family policies. And therefore, communism remained outside of the families. But it seems that now the communists who have now dressed in neoliberal suits don't want to follow the same tactics. They are now attacking the families and want to annihilate families. So what kind of a Europe is our objective and how can we achieve it? First of all, we have to state it, declare it, that the European Union is not Europe. Europe is much more than the European Union because Russia is also a part of Europe and we must take that into account. A common Europe cannot work without Russia. Russian culture is an important and enriching part of Europe. The second remark is that a united Europe following the American model is not possible and it's not advisable. It's impossible because we do not have a European nation. We have several different nations in Europe, so we do not have and we will never have a unified European nation with its own national identity. We also need a sovereign Europe. The most important criterion of which is to get rid of American dominance and American influence. We need a truly independent, sovereign Europe, which is not standing for the interests of another continent or another nation, but only follows and represents its own interest. We need politicians who are not dependent, either politically or financially, on an American NGO or an American institution. We need an independent Europe which will reinstate traditional European cultural values. Europe has always stood on three pillars which were now collapsed in the European Union. These three pillars are Christianity, Greek philosophy, and Roman law. We have to reinstate these three. First of all, Christianity as the symbol and the basis of European culture must be given a place in the new treaty. All Christian institutions must be absolutely supported, and we must protect them. Islam presents a big threat in Europe because Islam is not only a religion, but it is a state form as well. In many cities, Sharia courts have been set up, which create parallel state forms. The second pillar is the Greek philosophy. The European Union is not a democratic system. In every institution, in the European Union, they are lacking the democratic legitimacy. The European Parliament does not follow democratic principles because the representation is not proportionate. Also, the European Court has no legitimacy because the judges are appointed based on political principles instead of professional principles. So the role of the court is to be the engine of the European Union. It illegitimately goes beyond its competence, interferes in the state matters, and reduces the state's sovereignty. The third pillar is the Roman law, and actually it no longer exists in the EU because the EU has already breached and violated its own rules and ignores the sovereignty of the member states, and it's in complete conflict with the international law. It does not recognize the self-government of the peoples of Europe, like, for instance, in the Crimea and the Ukraine. It doesn't respect the basic constitutional rights of the countries or the fundamental human rights. One of the typical examples for that is a criticism about the Hungarian Child Protection Act, which specifies and gives priority to the parents to raise their children, and it prevents the LGBTQ rights. So the EU criticizes not only the Hungarian legislation, but also the Hungarian constitution that would put the protection of children, the protection of families as a priority. And the Article 8 of the European Treaty, European Charter, and also violates the Articles 23-24 of the Fundamental Human Rights Pact. So these are just some examples, but we could continue the list. So to finish the presentation, what will be the future of Europe? The deficit of democracy is irreparable in the European Union, and therefore it is very important to reinforce the sovereignty of the nation states, because only nation states present a viable future for Europe. And the nation states should not exist and maintained with dictatorial measures like in the EU, but their cooperation should be based on mutual independent cooperation, which is based on the principle of subsidiarity. So any kind of measures or regulations that go against it would be null and void. It is particularly forbidden to intervene in the internal matters of a state, and it is naturally used quite often to intervene in order to quote-unquote democratize a country. But that goes against democracy. If the EU defines itself as an organization of legality and rights and freedoms, then it must follow the regulations and it must follow the law. So it must be governed by the law. And the signature is Vienna, 14th of October, Eva Maria Barki, international lawyer.